In an alternate 1969 version, 2 astronauts were sent into space to carry out an important mission. However, their robot replicas remained on Earth, causing a major disaster in the lives of their families. Today we will recap the story of the 3rd episode of Black Mirror's 6th season, called Beyond the Sea. David is a family man who works for NASA and serves the United States as an astronaut. He has 2 children and a beautiful wife, with whom he is madly in love. Cliff is also an astronaut and lives with his family in a place away from the big city. Unlike his professional colleague, he is a strict man with his son and does not care much for his wife. One day, David goes to the movies with his family, and at the end of the film he is approached by a couple who say they are very happy to have the privilege of meeting him. The youngsters are impressed by how real that man seems to be and asks how things are going in space. At that moment, Jessica shows that she is annoyed by the situation and asks her husband to leave. After arriving home, David puts the children to bed and goes into the living room to enjoy the evening with his wife. The woman is having a drink when he pulls her up to dance and they both begin an exchange of caresses until David's watch starts beeping. At this point, he says goodbye to Jessica and informs her that he needs to go to work. Meanwhile, Cliff is helping Lana do the dinner dishes when he also receives an alert and walks to the office. Once there, he sits in a metal chair and his consciousness is sent back to his real body, which is inside a spaceship. After stretching out, the astronauts gather in the control room and David informs them that some debris has collided with the ship and caused a crack in the solar cladding. To fix it, Cliff needs to go out and remove all the accessories he is wearing, including his plate, before putting on the costume. He then goes to the crash site to weld the crack, and then returns to the ship. Before they return to their replicas on Earth, David asks his friend what his family is thinking of their new home, since they have recently moved to the interior. At this point, he discovers that Henry and Lana have not yet been able to adapt, but Cliff is not too worried about this, since he is feeling comfortable in this new life. Minutes later, the 2 astronauts say goodbye and agree to meet on Friday for their routine physical examination. After inserting their plates to activate the chamber, the consciousness of both is transported back into their respective bodies, and they return to their families. When he opens his eyes, Cliff walks into the bedroom to find his wife reading, as usual. Upon seeing him, Lana reveals that she is planning to throw a party in the garden of her house to welcome the neighbors, but Cliff is against the idea. The man then lies down on the bed next to his wife and, without even saying goodnight, turns off the lights to go to sleep. During the early morning hours, David hears a noise coming from the 2nd floor and decides to go downstairs to investigate. With a baseball bat in his hands, the man orders the 4 intruders out of his house, but they refuse to do so and manage to capture him. Next, Kappa orders his friends to stretch the astronaut's arm so that he can cut it off, and discovers that David is just a robot dressed as a human being. At that moment, the man orders Theta to fetch the rest of the family while he lands a blow on David's head. After the attack, the man wakes up in the ship and immediately returns to his replica in order to protect his family from those criminals. However, when he wakes up, he finds everyone gathered in the room and sees Jessica begging him not to hurt her children. The woman claims that both she and the children are real and only David is a replica, but Kappa says that this is irrelevant, because just the fact that they are living with that aberration already makes them sinners. Therefore, the man orders his partners to eliminate the woman and her children while David watches the brutality. In the morning, the phone rings and Cliff gets up to answer it. At that hour, he receives the sad news that David's entire family has been eliminated along with his replica. Concerned for his partner, Cliff immediately returns to the ship and finds David weeping in the greenhouse. However, when he tries to approach him, the man asks his friend to step aside and leave him alone, as he is in no condition to talk about what happened. When he returns to Earth, Cliff tells his wife about the disaster and says that the criminals who attacked the family have gone to the police station and turned themselves in. The group belongs to some kind of sect and invaded the house already with the intention of eliminating everyone inside. Upon hearing this, Lana becomes worried about what might happen to her family, but Cliff reassures her by saying that in that small town where they are living, no one knows who they are. In total, the astronauts will need to spend 6 years on mission and have completed only a third of that period. There are still 4 years left to go and Cliff worries about David's mental state, since it is not possible to make another replica of him without his DNA. The following weeks were extremely difficult for David, who spent most of his time alone on the ship. He watches the funeral of his family on TV and is no longer able to shed any tears. For several days, the astronaut wanders around the spacecraft unable, even for a moment, to stop thinking about the tragedy that has happened in his life. Meanwhile, Cliff continues to live happily alongside his family and is teaching his son to fish when he receives an emergency alert in the watch. Immediately, the man runs home and returns to the ship. When he finds David, he realizes that David is about to open the door and eject his body out in order to take his own life. Later, while talking to Lana, Cliff tells her what happened and says that the ship needs two people to function. This means that if one of them perishes, the other one will also be doomed. In an attempt to prevent this from happening, Lana suggests that her husband borrow her replica so that David can make a visit to Earth and can breathe fresh air. Since he has no better idea to prevent his death, Cliff decides to take his wife's advice and asks if David would like to use his replica for an hour while he has his routine checkups. Immediately, the astronaut buys the idea and says that he cannot wait to return to his planet. At the moment of establishing the connection with Cliff's replica, David is extremely anxious, but soon gets used to his new body and walks through the house paying attention to every detail of that new place. When he arrives at the entrance door, he spots Lana who, after greeting him, guides her guest so that he can take a walk in the forest. She takes David to meet her favorite tree and they both sit down to enjoy the beautiful landscape before their eyes. When he feels the breeze hitting his face, David becomes emotional and begins to cry. At this time, he is held by Lana, who hugs him and tries to comfort him for his loss. After shedding many tears, David begins to feel better and walks back home with his wife, and Cliff patiently awaits his friend's return. When they meet again, David congratulates him on his beautiful home and thanks him for the opportunity to visit Earth once more. Relieved to realize that his partner is feeling better, Cliff says goodbye to him and goes back to his sleep until the next physical examination. When he gets home, he asks his wife what happened, and finds out that David finally managed to release all the tears he had been holding back. Maybe this is why he was feeling lighter. On Friday, after the exam, David reveals that he needs to show something to his friend and tells him that he has drawn a picture of his beautiful house. Impressed by the beauty of that painting, Cliff says he wishes he could hang it on his living room wall, and David says he could paint something similar if his partner would allow him to use his replica again. Then, the man states that he will think about this possibility and talks to Lana before making a decision. He asks how the woman feels about David using his body for 1 hour, one time a week, while he does his physical test. That way, he can use the barn to do his painting. Although she does not like so much the idea, Lana agrees to receive David, as she is concerned about her husband's life in space. After helping the man get settled in the barn with all his new supplies, the woman is about to return home when David starts to bring up the subject of the book she is reading. The astronaut then says he will recommend some books for her, and Lana thanks him for being so thoughtful. In the following weeks, David continues his solitary routine on the ship and lives waiting for the moment when he can return to his painting, because this is the best time of his week. More and more, Lana comes to appreciate his company and he feels inspired by the woman's presence by his side. One day, after several weeks, the man decides to invite her to paint, and Lana enjoys herself as she works on developing that beautiful work of art. When he returns to the ship, David can't stop thinking about her and uses the moments he is alone to draw her. His painting is almost finished when the linseed oil, used to dilute the paint, runs out. So Lana decides to take him to the store to buy a new bottle of the product, and then they both decide to pay a visit to the nearest bookstore. After buying a new book, which David suggested to Lana, the duo returns home and, as usual, Cliff awaits his friend's return so that he can take control of his replica again. So David continues his artistic endeavors and goes back to drawing the woman he is falling in love with. The painting of the house is almost done when he shows Lana that he included her in the painting. He then asks her to dance. At this instant, the woman begins to smile and feels very happy to be noticed again, since Cliff has distanced himself from her since his real body was sent into space. During the dance, the man begins to caress her and awakens feelings in Lana that she has not felt for a long time. But the woman decides to stay away, for she realizes that by giving herself over to this feeling, she would be betraying her husband. However, David goes after her and tries to convince her to allow herself to live that love, but Lana has already decided that she will never do anything to hurt the vow of loyalty she made to Cliff. Disappointed, the astronaut goes back to the barn and, arriving there, finds a stain on his painting, which he soon discovers was caused by Henry. Furious, David lashes out at the boy, who rushes home angry at his father. When she finds out what happened, Lana asks him to go back to the ship and later tells her husband what happened. After hearing the story, Cliff tries to convince her about his friend and says that he knows how hard Henry can be to put up with. He then states that David didn't do anything so serious as to hurt the boy. Unhappy with her husband's words, Lana says she doesn't want to see David again, but Cliff tells her he wants to finish his painting and manages to convince his wife to receive him at her house a few more times so he can finish the job. As arranged, on Friday, while Cliff is exercising, David returns to the house and goes downstairs to talk to Lana when he realizes that the woman is furious with him. During the entire time that David is in her house, she stays distant with Henry and the astronaut has no choice but to finish the painting alone. Meanwhile, on the ship, Cliff has his exercises interrupted when the treadmill stops working, and so he must find something to distract his mind while David does not return. Finding nothing interesting to do, he decides to investigate his friend's quarters in order to find out what he is doing all the time he is alone in space. While observing every detail of that room, Cliff spots numerous drawings of David's late wife and children nailed to the wall. Then, looking through his notebook, the man finds several intimate portraits of Lana and is furious just to imagine that David is having an affair with his wife. At that instant, while finishing the picture, David receives an emergency alert on his watch and immediately returns to the ship. When he meets Cliff, he is confronted and must explain the origin of those drawings. David tries to apologize for having drawn his friend's wife, but Cliff is overcome with anger and attacks him. After being severely beaten, David tries to explain himself and states that he owns absolutely nothing. Everything he had was taken from him and destroyed before his eyes, without him being able to do anything to stop it. On the other hand, Cliff has everything a man could want, and yet he doesn't appreciate it. According to David, Lana is a lonely woman who, despite having her husband around, feels totally alone and unappreciated. Meanwhile, the woman is standing in the road with Henry waiting for David to leave so she can return home. When she finds her husband, Cliff asks her to accompany him to the barn and destroys the painting David has done. He then asks what happened between David and his wife, but Lana says she doesn't know what he is talking about. Then Cliff continues his questioning and asks if David has seen or touched his wife's body. Upon hearing this, the woman feels insulted and Cliff pressures her to tell him exactly what happened. When he realizes that Lana is telling the truth, the man discovers that there was interest only on David's part and his wife is innocent in this story. He then asks if Lana is lonely, and the woman states that she feels lonely all the time, even when her husband is around. Because of Cliff, his family moved to that town far away from everyone they knew, and since then they both look like two shadows wandering around a lifeless house. Upon hearing this, Cliff's eyes fill with tears and he feels sorry for not seeing his wife for all those years he was on a mission in space. So he hugs her and, ashamed of his actions, asks her forgiveness for the way he has been treating Lana recently. One Friday, after the physical examination, David approaches his mission companion and apologizes for what happened, because he recognizes that what he did was wrong. In an attempt to repair his mistake, David asks to use his friend's replica one last time to ask forgiveness, personally, to Lana. However, Cliff claims that Lana no longer wishes to see him and makes up several terrible things that he says his wife said about David, which makes the astronaut extremely sad. After several months of maintaining a sloppy appearance, David decides to shave and watches his partner while he sleeps. One morning, while having coffee with his family, Cliff receives an emergency alert, and when he arrives at the ship, David informs him that there was an impact a few minutes ago. According to him, due to the collision, a leak is occurring in the cooling pipe. Therefore, immediately, Cliff removes all his accessories and puts on his suit to leave the ship in order to repair the damage that has been done. However, when he approaches the cooler, the man realizes that there is no damage to be repaired and contacts David to find out what is going on. He tries to talk to his partner, but gets no response and soon begins to suspect that David is trying to get rid of him. Quickly, Cliff returns to the door and shouts for David to open it. After a few minutes, he begins to despair, then finally the green light comes on and the passage is unlocked. When he finds his partner, Cliff asks where he was and David says he needed to go to the bathroom. He then apologizes for being wrong about the damage to the cooler. After removing the costume, Cliff puts his accessories back on and notices that his plate is not on the tray. At this point, David takes the necklace out of his pants pocket and hands it to his old friend. When he realizes that the man has gone to visit his family during his time away, Cliff rushes to see how Lana is doing. When he gets home, however, he realizes that the situation is much worse than he could have imagined. His hands are covered in blood, as are the walls of the hallway leading to the kitchen. When he reaches the second floor of his house, the man finds his wife and son already lifeless on the floor and realizes that there is nothing more that can be done to save them. Faced with a huge pool of blood, Cliff despairs, and when he returns to the ship, he finds David sitting there waiting for him, as if nothing had happened. Now, besides having lost the people he loves most, the astronaut will still have to face the judgment of all those who will believe that he was responsible for taking the life of his own family. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.